everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Treasury's Vital Role in ERP Transformation Projects. I'm Kai from Strategic Treasurer, and we're really glad you could join us. Today we'll look at how organizations can simplify complex integrations, reduce technical burdens, and make ERP transitions as seamless as possible. Our speakers today are Jon Paquette, Chief of Strategy at TIS, and Craig Jeffery, Founder and Managing Partner of Strategic Treasurer. And with that, I'll turn things over to Jon and Craig to get us started.
Thanks so much, Kai. And Jon, it's good to be back on a webinar with you. It's been a while since we've presented live or in the digital world.
Yeah, I agree. It feels good to be back.
Yeah, so that's great. And everyone, thank you for joining us in your evening, afternoon, or late morning. We really appreciate you taking some time to follow up on these educational topics that are important to Treasury, technology, payables, everything. So thank you so much for spending some of your day with us. We have a lot to cover today. Not as many slides as we normally do, but we have a lot of good content to cover. And so we'll go through our agenda. We have 5 categories that we're going to be speaking to. First, we'll start off with ERP transformation. So ERP transformations are significant for organizations. It's the core accounting system. It's a significant effort. And if Treasury is involved late in the process, that's really suboptimal, or that's accounting speak, but you could say, or consultant speak, but you could say it stinks, it's inefficient. Getting involved early can be very strategic for what you're trying to do with data and connectivity, particularly from the treasurer perspective. It's not just about IT. It's not just about accounting. It's not just about a new system. It's about how the organization runs and works their financial processes. They'll move over to connectivity, and there's certainly levels of complexity. If you're seeing one company with one bank, one account, one payment type, you're not doing an ERP transformation. It's extremely simple. But it doesn't take long for organizations to have one or more systems, one or more banks, one or more payment channels with each bank, one or more information channels. So that complexity can grow. So what makes sense for your organization? How do you calibrate what you do, what you look at? So we'll talk through some of that in today's discussion. Then we'll look at early engagement. The being late is terrible. How do we get early engagement? And so we'll cover some of the key elements about moving from being reactive and responding to the ERPs going live in 3 months. We need to connect to our banks, to being proactive, getting involved in the process, and moving from this reaction or purely responsive to being very strategic and making sure you're building in what's necessary for your organization. And for questions to ask, we'll touch on what are some of the key questions to ask. We'll do that through a dialogue. Jon and I will talk through those things. And at the end, for key takeaways, so this is becoming a very long intro, going to be engage, strategy, and impact. So measuring impact, we'll touch on those. So we'll get to all of those in our discussion today. And so I'll bring Jon in. Jon, maybe you could talk us through the strategic context. You've been involved in a lot of these and in your role as a strategy officer in a tech firm, but involved in many companies. How do we understand the strategic context for what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. I think Craig implied well that the ERP obviously plays an important role within the business. It's almost like the centerpiece of the finance tech stack. It's where the book of record is for accounting. It's where most of your AP processing comes to a head. It's where a lot of reconciliation and cash applications happens, where inventory is tracked, right? So it's really an important piece of the puzzle that I think has historically both driven and to some degree limited finance's ability to really reach their ideal process state. And one thing that we'll talk a lot about today is ERP migration, in particular ERP cloud migration, which has sort of changed the model for most organizations and opened up a lot of doors that previously weren't possible. If you think about the historical model for ERP, you've had a lot of companies maintaining multiple different instances of the same or different versions of an ERP geographically, in local data centers to be able to support a really truly geographically dispersed business who has processing location in multiple different areas. And that's been a big limiting factor because it's very, very difficult to unify those environments across multiple ERPs without significant tech investment. But you fast forward to the advent of cloud technology, now you can take that ERP You can put it up in the cloud, right? And then all of a sudden, for the first time for a lot of businesses, they're able to get their entire business on one single instance of an ERP system. And so obviously, there's all sorts of efficiencies there. There's the IT efficiencies, obviously, from taking advantage of the more efficient architecture models that come with cloud hosting. But even more importantly, for the businesses, there's the opportunity to get everybody on standardized processes across the globe throughout the entire business, to get control, more visibility than they ever have before. And that's what we really see as businesses really looking to do when they go through these ERP migrations, almost like a full-blown finance transformation that's really supported by it. So we'll talk a lot about sort of that context during the course of the webinar today. Obviously, there are some disruptions to look out for here. When you're moving from old systems to new systems, it's typically a phased approach. It might be phased geographically, or you might be migrating off of certain ERP systems onto a new ERP system first. And with that comes the risk that things like payment flows or your reconciliation processes, or even the visibility that really feeds your liquidity management processes, are going to get disrupted along the way. If you don't really have the right strategy in place to, sunset the old ERP and activate the new ERP without really, undergoing some sort of disruption there. And Treasury plays a key role in that, obviously. And I think that's one of the key reasons that we see for why you should bring Treasury up, into the project really far in advance of when the ERP migration begins, something we'll talk about a lot today. But really, ensuring that business continuity, that you have the right strategy in place before the ERP migration starts, so that you don't have those disruptions in processes, and you can migrate critical things like bank connectivity and financial messaging seamlessly from one ERP to the other. But also thinking about the go forward a little bit too, because the goal of the ERP migration is never to replicate really what you had in place before. It's about to put in place a new model that's sort of supports the strategic needs of the business much, much better. And, by and large, really helps you to achieve the ROI that you want to on this very, very big investment on a cloud ERP system, and all those advantages of getting the business on the same ERP at the same time. So this is definitely, I think, sets a good context for what we want to hit on during the course of the webinar here today. And Craig, I know you want to talk a little bit more about Treasury's role in this whole process here too. So maybe I'll hand to you to take us through the next one.
Yeah, thanks. As you're talking through some of those items, a couple other things came to mind. So I'll try to weave those in as we talk through those. So what is Treasury's role? Is Treasury's role just to provide fulfill the order for, hey, we need to contact at a bank to make connections for this payment or that payment? The answer is no. That is not their role. That's serving and helping other areas is certainly part of it, but it needs to fit into the overall organizational mix and value. And so three things that Treasury is responsible for, that they owe the organization as part of their mandate, is one is they're the superintendent of payments. And for those hearing that for the first time, they say, that seems odd. That sounds like something to do with the school system. But superintendent of payments means that they're in charge of payments. Not every single component. Superintendent does not drive the bus, teach every class, mop the floors, order the materials, provide security, etc. But as superintendent of payments, the treasurer, the Treasury group, is responsible for linking payment processes up with their key bank partners. Those bank partners provide services, they provide access to capital. It fits within the overall organizational requirements. So they have a charge for the relationship. And as superintendent of payments, they are heavily involved in security, though they're not doing all the security functions. They have a responsibility to make sure that payments are secure, that good practices, standards of good corporate conduct, and commercially reasonable procedures are followed. So thinking through those 4 items and more that are listed here: bank connectivity, accounts and entities, all of this has to be managed in a way that makes sense for the overall organization, not optimizing, just payroll or one area of AP or procurement or admin system area. It's solving this problem across the board. And part of those challenges too, there's changing formats that become required. There's compliance that has to be followed. It might be related to what has to be included in the messages you send for payments. Maybe an international wire needs floor location, need detailed information broken out in detail. And so it should be solved for the organization across the board, not one off. The fact that there's a change in the ERP transformation process, that's a good opportunity to put in the new approach that makes sense for today, not replicate what was done 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but putting something in that helps with the new formats, payment channels, new expectations, and flexibility, so you don't repeat yourself 50 times. I could see you nodding, John, there. It's so important. Sometimes we're like, hey, we have to hurry. We don't have time to remake things. Let's replicate what we have. You're going to replicate a 25, 30-year-old process. That is not appropriate. Just like when you move to the new ERP, it's on a new type of platform, it has faster development. Same thing too is how you your connections with your banks, how you integrate like that. The second area is liquidity management. Connecting to your bank is not just about moving funds. It's where is my cash? What bank? What account? What currency? Seeing that every day, and sometimes on a real-time basis or throughout the day. This helps Treasury be good stewards of their most liquid asset, cash. And so liquidity management, and we can think of that as current, short-term, be credit as well, but having full visibility to your current and short-term needs makes sense. And we also listed forecast alignment with ERP data. The importance of forecasting has only increased over the last 10 years. Sometimes it's increased rapidly. Expectations are higher by management, by Treasury. And this is the fact that you can now tap into more ERP data, or you might be able to do that more effectively, is a real opportunity, something that we don't want to squander, lose that opportunity. So liquidity management is the second area. And then just briefly on working capital management, we would think about working capital, not the current assets minus current liabilities working capital, but focus on receivables, payables, and inventory, the cash conversion cycle. The more effectively an organization can turn that, the more efficient they are, the better their position to grow, to scale. And there's a financial side of that, there's a financial operation side of that, and then there's a physical operation side of delivering goods and services. And Treasury cares about the financial side and the financial operation side most importantly, or they're most able to influence that, while there's other areas and groups that may focus on, let's say, physically managed inventory. But these are important because the Treasury cares about capital, liquidity, payments, security, relationships, investment management. There's a number of areas besides these three. And John, I went into some detail there, but happy to have you make any comments or add to that at all.
No, I think they're all really good points. I mean, we think a lot about the connectivity and the payments when it comes to ERP migration, but also, going from a multi-ERP setup to one cloud ERP gives you access to much better data for liquidity management planning, the receivables and payables information all in one system versus spread out across 5, 6 systems, how you integrate that back into your forecasting system. And then certainly how you sort of unlock additional liquidity through optimizing working capital as well is definitely a sort of a strategic way that I think Treasury can definitely capitalize on the ERP migration, something that should definitely be thought of up front when you're thinking about how that investment's going to pay off and how we're going to set these processes up. So I think these are definitely some of the key areas here to focus on.
I think that's a really good point, right? Having things in one area, I think there's the natural beauty of that, right? It's easier to go to one source than 10. And that's one truism or maxim that we can think of. The other is most organizations are in a state of change. They're acquiring companies, they're acquiring systems, they have to access more data from more places. It's not static. It's not like, hey, we moved to an ERP system and now we're stable. There's an aspect of this move or an ERP transformation is an opportunity to make sure you're flexible going forward, that there might be other ERPs that get acquired. You might be merging one ERP system into another admin system is coming on board. So there's a flexibility level to that too, that sometimes we can, I don't want to say overlook, but sometimes we can think we're moving to one ERP system, everything's going to be perfect. It's going to be in one place, but it's like organizations in motion for the most part. So John, what do you think? Let's have a poll question.
Yeah, I think it's a good time for one.
Perfect timing. So how early does your treasury team typically engage in ERP projects? Now, there might only be one, maybe you haven't started one, maybe it's maybe it hasn't happened, maybe it's completed. To the best of your ability, answer, when does your treasury team typically engage? Planning, design or build, testing or go live, not involved, haven't participated, or on the outside. So go ahead and answer that and hit submit when you're done. And if you can't see the poll question, Kai has listed some methods of getting to that, alt tab and some other instructions in the chat box. We're going to say, if 100 people type in TIS in the chat box, TIS is a tech vendor, John's part of that, and a bunch of services that help with connectivity, of course. You type in TIS, that's a good way to remember it. We get 100 of those, we will include all the results from the polls in the deck that gets sent out. It's our way of showing engagement, not being mean, but just showing how you can connect there. So it's fun to see it light up, and then we know how to spell it, right? All right, so I think we're getting close to everyone having filled in the first poll question. Look at this, John. This is the group, 45% from the planning phase.
Yeah, that's great.
These are the ones that broke the curve in college, I can tell. That's a good designer build a little bit later. That gets us up to 66% or 2/3. And then the ones like only during testing or go live, not involved, haven't participated. That's another 20%. And that happens. I would say that happens more in the real world than perhaps our particular audience. So, but any thoughts on either these numbers or any comments on this general topic?
Yeah, I'd say the numbers are great. Definitely better than my expectations. I think a lot of companies that we talk to are in the not involved, haven't participated, or only during the test and go live phase category, actually, where they're kind of like, somebody who's maintaining an ERP migration plan has their name marked next to some tasks, but hasn't really engaged them up to the point when that plan was created, and really is more expecting them to be sort of supporting the implementation as it goes forward. And then obviously, that's not how you get the most out of the investment, or that's not how the process goes the smoothest. So involving Treasury from the beginning is absolutely critical. I know we're going to talk about that as we move on in the webinar as well. But really happy to see so many involved in the planning phase and the design and build phase for sure.
Yeah, that's good. And it's easy to think of. The other area doesn't care about this or that. So if you're in Treasury, like, oh, we need to be involved in that for these great reasons. But the other area maybe it's like, we're just making a connection at the bank. We'll get them involved when we need to talk to the bank at the end. And you may say that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I've also heard Treasury people do the same thing. We don't need to involve the people that do reconciliation, get involved in this new process we're putting in with our bank that has different timing and different elements of detail. We don't even need to get them involved before the first of the month that we're starting, because they're not going to do reconciliation to the end of the month. So we'll contact them on the 7th saying, hey, data's flowing through, get ready. And they're like, why are you waiting this long? And both of those issues are letting people know too late. So design, prior preparation prevents poor performance. Those that like alliteration, that's a good one. But planning phase is awesome. So I'm impressed with this group already. And Kai is responsible for counting up all the TISs in the chat box. Tell me the number to see if we made it in the first pitch. So that's how we keep everybody fully engaged. So it's good stuff, John. All right, John, walk us through this beautiful, what is that? What is that thing you used to do with the strings, right? We go back and forth, like it's a spider web. I don't know what this is, but maybe you could talk us through why does direct connectivity become hyper complex so rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is something we see really commonly that companies are coming from before they pursue the ERP migration. So we thought it was an interesting thing to touch on here. And it's not even, I think, just direct connectivity with the ERP system. It's, sort of the meshing of multiple different connectivity models that have kind of emerged naturally within the business over time. And you can definitely see some of the challenges I mentioned here before around businesses being multi-ERP because of the different geographies and the need to host those systems on premise, the need to connect all different departments who need to, leverage that connectivity and financial messaging and things like that. And before you know it, you have this sort of spider web that's kind of grown over time. And there's a lot of reasons why this happens. Like Craig mentioned before in the previous slide, businesses are never static. They're always growing, either organically or through acquisition. They're moving into new markets. If they do an acquisition, suddenly they're bringing on more ERP systems, more bank relationships, right? And before you know it, you end up with something that looks like this, or you might manage your processes through a decentralized organization structure where maybe the local finance functions are responsible themselves for making payments and doing reconciliation versus doing things centrally, which kind of brings about this model as well. Or it could be lack of a defined bank connectivity strategy to sort of really roll out within the business to tell people, what the expectation is for how they're going to connect up with their banks and ultimately make payments, right? So I think we see that a lot too, because these processes are so mission critical. You need to make payments. If the business just doesn't make payments, obviously it's a huge disruption in the supply chain. So without a really good strategy of how to do that, how to bring on new entities, how to connect with new banks, and what the expectations are around how to make payments, people are just going to find a way. They're just going to make payments anyway through whatever means they have possible or connect up to bank relationships. And before you know it, you have this kind of spider web thing that you're ultimately looking to untangle here. And there are obviously a lot of impacts from this that the businesses feel and they want to mitigate during the course of the ERP migration. One is definitely the excessive costs. You can see here, it's not uncommon to have multiple connections to the same bank relationship, which they're obviously going to be, charging for. Also internally, the cost to maintain so many different, connections and the different formats that actually need to move, to actually transmit the financial messages back and forth between the banks and the financial systems creates a huge internal cost that sometimes people understate. The lack of visibility, I think, is, you can really see that from the graphic as well, in terms of how you actually see what's moving through the business for payments. What are the, what's in the bank accounts? What are the cash flows that are really sort of impacting what the local liquidity positions look like and things like that? Almost impossible to track down when you have a system like this. The lack of control, how are people making payments, even managing access credentials to all the different systems and banks that are involved in a model like this. It's just impossible to, make a payment policy, anything more than a paper policy, and really hard code it in with a confusing environment like this. And at the end of the day, it's just not scalable. It's every time the business changes again, every time you move into a new market or switch out a bank relationship, you're just creating another string in the spider web graph, right? You're not really getting out of this game. You're just adding and adding and adding to the problem. And I think that's something that, Treasury teams definitely recognize as they go into a ERP migration project. And one of the biggest things that they're looking to clean up, because it really has impacts across the business up and down in terms of payments controls, cash management, all the different processes that impact Treasury. So it's a great reason for why, as we keep on saying, don't replicate what you had before, but really sit back and think about a model that's going to really support your business on a go-forward basis and achieve the kind of scalability you want to really get out of your bank connectivity model and the return on investment you want to get from your ERP migration as well. So,
that was really helpful. I think there's a couple other things that could be in this chart as well. Questions. What if you have a separate TMS? Well, that TMS could be sitting here on the left side, needing information from third-party data and banks. You may also have a supply chain financing provider, right? That needs to send information back to one or two of the ERPs or maybe to a treasury system. Those are great questions. Thanks for popping those into the Q&A box. And you see how they go to multiple systems, right? So each of those are connections, whether host to host or APIs or otherwise. They're connected, they're maintained. And I really appreciate you walking through it. And then, this picture of a treasury aggregator, so someone like a TIS that connects to those, normalizes the data, connects to the other ones, makes sense, certainly from a cleanliness of the picture standpoint. But would like you to talk through this a little bit, like what is a treasury aggregator, And how does it fit in this middle? I always think of the phone systems, like you could call people directly. You're on a line to 3 of your friends' houses, where you have 3 separate phones, one for each person. It's like, it's nice if you can just use a number to reach the other person directly, but you could talk us through this.
Yeah, and it's definitely a model that we've seen work really well in the context of ERP migration, which would be sort of how I frame this conversation. But just just to explain a little bit about what a treasury aggregator is, it's exactly what you kind of see here on the screen. It's something that sort of sits between the middle of your bank relationships, or even some of the networks that you might be accessing that are non-bank networks, and the source systems and people that actually need to access those bank relationships, and really normalizes the connection in between the two. So, all the connections up to everything you need to really interact, whether directly through the treasury aggregator, not through the source systems, right? So that's a big advantage of it. But even more so, all the messaging is also normalized so that when you're sending, say, payment instructions out to the bank, you're able to send generic instructions from the source system and convert those into the nuances of the bank country payment method specific format before it goes out. Same thing on the way back in for the bank reporting, payment statuses, and things like that. You can normalize all those message formats and really, make it a streamlined process for integrate that information back into one or more ERP systems or TMS or whatever it might be. So obviously that's a great, technical solution. You can also incorporate the people aspect onto that as well. So, for us, the collaboration is just as important so that people across the globe can go on the platform to approve payments at certain thresholds. You can get complete visibility into what's flowing through the business, both inbound and outbound from a cash flow perspective. You can layer on additional value add tools for fraud prevention or, sanctions monitoring and things like that, right? So foundationally, that's what a sort of treasury aggregator is. But in the context of the ERP migration, there are some really key advantages to using a system like this based on what we see. So I think fundamentally, one of the core things that you're doing here is you're really outsourcing the complexity of bank connectivity and financial messaging to another third party. And that's really important in the context of the ERP migration, because that can, if you don't have somebody handling that for you, that can kind of become a project within a project for the ERP migration itself and become a big distraction point. I know I keep saying it, but they're huge. ERP migrations are huge investments, and you want to be able to focus on the operational improvements you get from unifying the whole business, not all these technical aspects that you have to deal with just to get the ERP working, right? And we've seen companies kind of get dragged down a rabbit hole if they don't have a good strategy in place to really do that. The second key benefit is the business continuity aspect of it. I mean, if you think about this model here, everything from the treasury aggregator to the right, where you see the bank relationships, is actually completely decoupled from the ERP landscape. So regardless of what system you have to connect into that, really there's no disruption of processes. So that provides businesses with a lot of flexibility to say go from ERP 1, 2, 3, like you see listed here, as they get closer to the migration date, switching off those connections and switching on the connection to the new cloud ERP without completely losing, really the functionality of the old ERP system, where if you didn't have something that was decoupled like this, you'd be trying to turn off, one bank connection from the old ERP, activate another one for the new ERP system with the right timings to make sure that you didn't have disruption on either side during the migration. So it becomes a lot more of a flexible process from that perspective. And like I mentioned before, it also lets you work with generic formats from your ERP system, both outbound and inbound, which simplifies things on the IT side as well. But maybe just as importantly, we always talk about it's not just about how you get through the ERP migration, but how you put in place a scalable process that's going to support your business on a go-forward basis. You now have something that you can use to connect up to any new bank relationship that you add, any new area geography that you move into. If you do an acquisition, bring on another ERP system that you need to migrate over time, you can plug that into the same model without creating the spider web, without really losing the visibility, the control, everything that really you had put in place here, which is just as important for businesses as well. So from that perspective, we've seen a lot of value, and projects go much, much smoother with this type of model in place than if people are sort of trying to untangle that spider web on their own, for sure. So.
Yeah, on the on this view, you can see, different banks there and number of connection points. So each, maybe some of these connections are SFTP, some of them might be APIs, others may be coming through Swift or other different types of networks. And so as they change and they can improve, then you isolate those changes from the underlying systems, or you minimize the impact of those through this system. If you have one bank, one accounting system, and that's it, it's unlikely you're going to say, I need another step. But very quickly, organizations have multiple back-end systems. They have multiple banks, multiple third-party systems that they use, like SCF, et cetera. So now you're in the position of needing to wanting to simplify that. So I'm replacing ERP3 with another, I'm replacing ERP2 and 3 with another centralized ERP. Well, now if I have an aggregator, I can be running my tests. I can run my tests at the same time. I'm still in production, and then I can cut over. So I don't have to establish a new connection, a second connection running parallel for all these for a long period of time. I can push the data here. I can run my payment tests and make sense out of that. So it's a great way to simplify that. So if you go ahead and look at the screen, somewhere on your screen, you'll find poll question number 2. Which connectivity approach does your organization primarily use today? ERP-native connectivity, so connecting your ERP directly to a data provider, connecting to a bank, connecting to a payment provider. Use an external treasury aggregator like a TIS. Use a hybrid approach. You have some direct connections and use an aggregator. You're still evaluating, or other, or unsure. Maybe not sure how that happens. And I can tell from the chat box what has come in is that we have enough people typing the word TIS in the chat or in the Q&A to complete our 100. So thank you for doing that, for your engagement. So we're all set there. Yep, so we'll see the poll is open. The poll looks like it's closed. Now we have the results. So John, number 1, ERP-native connectivity, a little over a third. So they probably could have heard your message a little earlier. We've got external treasury aggregator, 14%. So some have, and then a hybrid approach using some of both. This is definitely becoming more current. So between those, we've got 66% and still evaluating or unsure, 12 and 21%. As you look at hybrid, do you think that's going to become more common in organizations because they may use an aggregator, but you acquire a company that already have a direct connection for inbound information, or they have a recon platform that's getting a feed from the bank?
Yeah, I think you see that commonly is that, we've even seen larger multinationals have multiple different aggregators in some respect where, different finance centers have chosen different connectivity strategies. But certainly you do see a lot of this hybrid approach coming about as a result of acquisitions. I'd say the most common strategy that we do see is some degree of ERP-native connectivity with, say, the core cash management banks that really drive, say, the AP processes and things like that. And then other approaches for the rest of the banks, like e-banking portals and the reporting solutions to try to sort of bring in the rest of that. So I think it's not uncommon to see a couple different approaches in play at most companies. It's it's nice to see that we do have 14% who are probably working with the centralized aggregator model and probably getting a lot of the benefits that we just mentioned on the last slide here. But definitely this mix of different strategies is something that we definitely observe in conversations that we have.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thanks for the dialogue on that, John. And let's continue to push through some of the slides and the content that we have. So when we say the relevance of connectivity, why connections matter to Treasury, it's like, you're in Treasury, you care about money. Why do you care about connectivity? Well, here are 4 of some of the top 8 reasons why we would say connections matter to Treasury. Data, systems, reporting, and analytics all matter to Treasury. Connectivity is a key part of that. So the first one there is the number of point-to-point connections to be maintained matters. More connections means more cost, more points of failures, more things that have to be monitored. There is nothing that helps an organization when you have 400 connections when you could have 20, and if they're managed, maintained, and looked at and cared for properly. So the number of point-to-point connections is a key area. And that is also the ability to manage them as they change over time. new formats, new connection methods, better ways of establishing that, more affordable ways of establishing that. All of those make it harder the more point-to-point connections that you are maintaining. Secondly, the cost of connections and the cost of data, let's put those together, number 2 and 3. The more every connection you have has to be supported. You can attribute certain costs to them. We have some models that we use to show how costly it is, and your company may have ways of showing how much does it take your IT group to support all of these connections, all of these formats. Every time there's a change, how many systems you have to open up, put those changes through. So there's the cost of the connections themselves, maybe the fees from the data provider, fees for data, fees for connection type, number of files that are passed through or touched, and those matter. And the cost of data, we say the third one is cost of data multiplied by the number of connections. If you have, let's say, transactional data coming from your bank, you feed it to your treasury system, you pay for it once. You get transactional data, you feed it to your reconciliation system so that you can do the reconciliation. You pay for that data a second time. Maybe you feed that same data and pass it to your accounting system or your AR system, and so it's posting there and you're using it, and now you're paying for it a third time, paying for the connections, paying for the data. So it is important to manage your overall costs, and the structure you put in place can either help you with your costs for all of the things that you do in the future, or it can create a situation where I'm going to be paying more for everything. I'm going to have more touch points, paying for data more regularly. I have more systems to support and maintain. I make my life more complex, or I make my life simpler. And so that strategic element matters. The fourth area here, and there's more areas. I would certainly let people, if they want to type in the chat box what other areas they see and relevance for connectivity. There's others, and feel free to type those in. But transformation project ease is certainly significant. And the fact that you may have a single large transformation project that everyone talks about and gets concerned about should not diminish the fact that you'll have many changes, and the fact that you have to handle changes with new systems, acquisition of companies that need to be integrated into your platform. Do you let them ride on the old platform that the other company was using? Do you integrate them in? How easily can you integrate them in? How quickly can you put them on your platform? And how does that matter for forecasting, for control, for efficiency, for cost? So any type of change either is easier or harder depending on what you've done. It certainly is the case with transformation projects. John, I talked a lot there. You were patient. You didn't jump in, but feel free to make any comments.
Yeah, I think that transformation piece and maintaining that flexibility is absolutely key, because treasurers are in a sort of an odd place right now where there's certain emerging technologies that might not be completely ready to support all of their use cases, but it's certainly really compelling to treasurers, like open banking APIs, for example, bank APIs, which might not be quite ready to support, say, your full payment process, but people still want to take advantage of for things like real-time reporting, real-time balance reporting. So having the flexibility to be able to move between those connection methods from something like a host-to-host connection, which might be suitable today, to an API in the future while minimizing the IT involvement is really key. And there's a lot of examples of that where changes in technology are happening here that treasurers are sort of on the cusp of taking advantage of. Instant payments is another one that really stands out, right? That a lot of really interesting use cases are emerging for now that businesses want to take advantage of, and things that are more industry driven, even like ISO migration, which is a key topic that a lot of companies are dealing with. That isn't just sort of a one and done thing. It's sort of always going to be, moving in the new direction. You can see that now with the changes from ISO v3 to v9, and obviously with what comes next. So I think it's a good point about why this matters to Treasury. It's to maintain the flexibility to be able to either adapt to the latest version of the industry standard or take advantage of new technologies and connectivity methods, payment instruments as the use cases sort of relate well to your business. So I think that's a great point.
All right, our third and final poll question. Which treasury areas do you anticipate would be the most impacted in a future ERP transformation? Visibility, payments and bank connectivity, liquidity management, working capital management, other, or insure. So go ahead and answer that. We have enough TISs in the chat box, but we do appreciate your enthusiasm. There's some questions like if you missed a poll question and you have your CTP, and will you still be eligible to receive credits? The answer is yes. CPA is looking for CPE activity. You do need to answer all of them. And if there's any questions, we will pop some more information in the chat box. Kai was gracious enough to put 2 follow items within the chat box. And so those items you can see, follow TIS or follow Strategic Treasurer. And we do appreciate if you can follow on LinkedIn. That's a good way to connect. It's very helpful for a couple of reasons, and we'd like you to do it. So feel free to do it. There's no cost for connecting on LinkedIn. All right. So John, I want you to be ready with your answers. Which one do you think will be most impacted? Have it ready to go. As soon as the thing disappears from the screen, you say which one you think is going to be the biggest.
Payments and banking activity, I would say.
Sounds good.
See.
Whoa, look at that. 18 points over liquidity management and 20 over cash visibility. So you nailed it. Yeah, feel free to talk about any thoughts here you have on this, what you've seen. That's the only one that's above 50%.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is, definitely one of the key objectives that we see companies looking to put in place with an ERP migration is a true, say, standardization, automation of their global payments processes and also policies, making sure that everybody's initiating payments the same way and they have a go-forward model to be able to implement however their business changes if they move into new markets or whatever it might be. So I'm obviously not surprised to see that. Cash visibility, liquidity management, I would say are up there, on equal footing in terms of importance as well. There's the advantages that you get from an ERP transformation that unify that data and make you be able to drastically cut down the time it takes to position cash, to forecast, and ultimately how that drives your daily and weekly cash management decisions is another thing that could be truly transformational for businesses as well. And I'm actually really happy to see working capital so high too, because that's becoming an area, Craig, like you mentioned, that Treasury is getting more and more ownership over, it seems like. And ERP migration certainly can play a role in unifying that data and helping companies keep a closer eye on, particularly AR and AP, and some trends and things that they can do to unlock, more liquidity and really sort of improve cash flow for their businesses. So overall good. Only a small percentage are unsure, so that's also good. People seem to really see the value of a cloud ERP transformation.
Yeah, the increase in the value on working capital management, supply chain financing, there's been over a decade of that trend in that direction, but it's such a slow trend. It's like this, it's like adding layers of paint. It's not like someone stuck boards on there.
Yeah.
But it's moving in one direction, and that's useful to know. Some organization moves in a different direction, but I want to thank everybody for answering all the poll questions if you did, and engaging in the chat box. On this engaging early slide, we have plan, design, build, test, and go live. And this is a time John and I are going to just go back and forth a little bit about why you engage early. And I'll start with something, and feel free to jump in, John. We'll just bounce it around. If you're planning an ERP transformation, you want to get in on the planning. But part of that too is you also want to have a design for how are you going to connect to your banks, financial institutions for information reporting, for payments, for gathering the data you need for analysis. I think that design, Treasury needs to have their tech stack and their overall schematic in their minds, whatever stage is, not say, I've got to build it when they call me from the ERP project. And I think if you do that, you're building people or helping people get into the mindset of a reasonable stack of data, connectivity, systems, and reporting analytics. Otherwise, it's like built in to be reactionary.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, I think overall, a project plan without Treasury's input won't consider the inefficiencies that Treasury really wants to address, it could address during the course of an ERP migration. And they might also not consider certain industry trends that they might want to address as part of the migration as well. And one that I keep bringing up, and I think it's a great one, is ISO 20022 migration. Most of the companies that we work with today that are doing ERP migration, sort of using TIS, we fully recommend that they move to the ISO format at that time and migrate off some of these legacy formats as they sunset their ERP system. But it could be that the people who are planning the ERP migration are completely unaware that there's an opportunity to do that now and haven't sort of incorporated that into the project plan. There's also sort of some considerations, I think, in terms of the bank relationships, and that Treasury might be more aware of than the project planners are as well, in terms of how long will it take us to engage the banks for testing resources so that we don't hold up the project when we get to a certain region because we're not able to test within the new ERP system. So I think all these things are really great reasons for why Treasury should get engaged early. And it seems like the projects that we see where Treasury does get engaged early, they become really a core driving member of the project team, and the projects go much, much smoother. Because I would say this bank connectivity financial messaging aspect is really important for the success of an ERP migration and not falling down all these technical rabbit holes and things like that. So, yeah.
If you're not involved on the front end, what happens is there's a rush and we have deadlines. So we're going to replicate what we did with the old ERP system. We have a deadline. So we're used to connecting with old formats, old connection methods, and all point to point. And that's a significant problem. It's I don't know who has power lines above the ground or under the ground, or your water lines are almost always under the ground. Anytime you dig up some utility line or some utility path, that's the time where you lay something different, right? If they put in new, they put in fiber in the office, or they're opening up, laying cable for computer connectivity, you're going to say, put us on the newest version that has the highest throughputs, the best shielded cables, because there's a certain cost for opening up, digging the ground, opening up the walls for running a new water line or a power line. When you do that, doesn't that make sense when you do that at home to run those new power lines, or put in an extra outlet in the wall just in case, because it's cost you $200 now versus $2,000 later. So you run and you build those capabilities. I think that's an appropriate way to think about when there's a big transformation project, to make sure you're making the changes that will benefit your organization for the next 12 to 20 years. So when you're opening it up, put in better connections, better formats, more resilient processes that will benefit the whole area, the whole company, not just that one particular point. And slab breaks are no fun was typed into the host and panelists, which is exactly accurate, John. Once you're breaking the slab up to run something in there, put the best tech in there.
Yeah, agreed. Exactly. And there's also other opportunities for Treasury to address things that maybe were inefficiencies that the project team wouldn't be aware of, like the fact that, hey, we can now integrate, say, 100% of the forecast information we need from the AP and AR modules, versus before we couldn't do that because it was scattered between a few different ERPs. So let's make sure that gets into the project plan, and all these different ways that Treasury can really benefit that can be brought right to the forefront right at the beginning and help generate that ROI on. Like I keep saying, this is a huge major investment for companies. So you might as well get as much out of it as you can as you're going through the process.
Yeah, rework is hard. So make it so that when you make changes, you're moving to your desired future state with each step. This is another slide for more of a discussion. So the key questions. There's a few areas on here. We just want to talk through them. We have, the integration aspect. We have, costs. We have scalability, financial impacts, et cetera. So I don't know if you want to start off. I could start off as well, John. Just what are the questions we should be answering in our minds?
Yeah, all these are great questions for sure. They're all things that should definitely be brought up, or at least considered as part of the project planning. There are definitely a couple that stand out to me, I'd say, and maybe starting at the end here with number 8, do we have the internal skills and resources needed for the deployment? I think that's a really important question to ask yourselves. Like if you really think about just the complexity of banking formats, financial messaging formats, do we have people internally that really understand that well enough to be able to build that in-house and deal with all those nuances for the different bank relationships that we have to deal with? Because we run into a lot of situations where we've gone into companies after the fact to help them sort of correct missteps, and they learned that they didn't, and they had to employ consultants to do this, and it cost them a lot of money, and it sort of delayed the project and things like that. So like there are a lot of very technical components here that can really derail the project if you don't have the right knowledge up front. I think that's something to always be kind of asking yourself as you go through, and sort of tick off each one of these technical topics. And I think 6 is key too, because another one you don't think of during the implementation, when the emphasis is on getting the new ERP system up and running and functioning properly, but it's who owns it, who owns it on an ongoing basis, the updates, the testing, the bank recertifications. It's because this will happen. You will want to test new payment methods. You will want to bring on new banks. Authentication certificates expired, have to be renewed. There are all these different topics, and it's a question of does Treasury have access to do this, the expertise to do this? Will the IT teams give them access to the administration modules they need to maintain this on their own, or do the IT teams need to do this? And it's another thing that's solved very, very nicely through the aggregator model. But I'd say that it's something in general that teams should definitely be asking themselves. And I was happy to see that on here as sort of one of those more forward-looking planning questions that should definitely be asked up front.
Yeah, and certainly back to 3 and 4, right? The multiple payment standards and changing payment standards, new information that's included. The more underlying systems you have, the harder it is to support those. And John had mentioned ISO 20022, or some of the pain formats where, it's coming out in XML format, so everything's tagged. You can include rich information. This other aspect of APIs, newer connection types, and then tying that into real-time access to global cash positions. Your initial response may be, we don't need real time. Overnight's fine, or within an hour is fine, within 4 hours is fine, whatever those things are. But over your career, you certainly have noticed things get faster, they don't get slower. The expectation is that they get faster. They need to be secure, and they need to be done in a way that makes sense for the organizations. But there is a push in one direction only, and that's for faster information, the ability to analyze more rapidly and more accurately. And so real time isn't necessary in every case, but there's nothing that's going slower. And so this idea of how do we support technologies that help us do things more rapidly and efficiently, and how do we position ourselves to be able to move more quickly each time? If our goal is to be more efficient over time, one aspect of that is often there's a speed element to that, speed, completeness, and automation aspect to those.
Yeah, I think 2 is a great one too. I mean, I'm sure we could go through all of them and say a word or two about every single one, but how well will the solution handle future growth and acquisitions? We keep calling attention to it. You're never done. Something is always going to be changing. So thinking about that up front, I think is really important. We always think of when we go into a business and implement our software, we're never like doing an implementation like one and done. We're really setting the business up with like a model, a tool that they can really use to manage those changes on a go forward basis, because things just are not static. And I think that's something to definitely consider upfront in all of your selections for how you integrate, particularly banks into your cloud ERP system on a go forward basis.
Yeah, excellent. That brings us to our final thought slide. And so John will start us off. We have a couple things we wanted to just reinforce and maybe expand on just slightly as we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, the first one, I think we hit it, quite a bit during the course of the conversation here. Engage early, and I know that's not always up to Treasury. They sometimes have to get out there in front of the people that are managing the ERP migration or making the project plan and say, hey, involve us, make sure that we're involved in this. We play a critical role in the selection of, a lot of the different technologies are going to come into play here and how they're going to fuel the, the return on investment that we want here. But you definitely don't want to get into that situation where you're going down the road here and you're just replicating what you had in place previously, because this is a tremendous opportunity for organizations, cloud ERPs, like I mentioned, the cloud technology, the ability to get everybody on the same system, the efficiencies that come with that, everything that sort of feeds downstream to more of the strategic activities. There's a great ROI to be had here, but it all involves good planning and getting engaged, very, very early in the process for sure. And then, yeah, I mean, evaluate the connectivity strategies. We called attention to a couple during the course here. Like I mentioned, I'm obviously in favor of the aggregator strategy. It's not for everybody. Maybe you don't have the bank complexity and it's not really the right model for you. But if you do, I would certainly be a proponent of that, at least considering it, because it does allow you to really both outsource the complexity that really goes into that aspect of the ERP migration and make for like a much smoother rollout, but then even more importantly, provide that scalable model on a go-forward basis, something that you can really use to, drive strategic objectives for the business, expand into new markets. Just, I always think of it as like having the answer card when somebody comes to you and asks, hey, we're moving into this new market. How are we going to connect up to the banks? That's a good peace of mind to have for sure. So, yeah, so those are definitely two really key final thoughts that we definitely wanted to leave with you here. And I think we have one more here, Craig, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, on the design standpoint and your plan for your connectivity, your data plan, your connectivity plan, it is good to lay that out so people can understand what things look like or how you're planning on going about doing that on an ERP project or in general. The other thing that's important and rarely done is tracking the visibility gains and the efficiency gains that you have in your organization. Now we see 80% of our accounts, 99% of our cash flow, all of our currencies within this period of time. The second thing is quantify the time and cost savings that you have. Cost savings can come from what does it cost you to pay the bank for sending the same files 3 different times? File fees, transaction fees, volume. What about the cost of maintaining 4 connections to one bank for the same account to go back to 4 underlying systems? Those are ineffective. And so as you build those efficiencies, it is useful to report those. So it's here's where we were, here's where we're moving, here's why it matters. It matters from a cost perspective, a fee perspective, it matters from a cost and efficiency perspective. And then on the strategic side, you can scale much more rapidly. Your visibility, efficiency, the insights you can achieve, all of those matter significantly. So those are some of the final thoughts that Jon and I had for you. There's certainly more. I'm sure each of you have some other thoughts, but hopefully that's enough good fodder to get engaged with ERP projects, build your own model. So Jon, thank you so much. And everyone, thanks for joining. We do have another report to download, and Kai will close out our meeting with a few announcements.
Thank you all for joining us today. You'll receive your CTP credits, a copy of the presentation slides, and a recording of today's webinar within 5 business days. Before you go, don't forget to download the cash forecasting and visibility survey results report using the link in the chat. Thanks again for spending part of your day with us. We hope you have a great rest of your day.